Hello everybody and welcome back to Megaprojects. This one is all about an arch. It's bigger than the Arch of Triumph. There's that. Also, if you'd like to get yourself some Megaprojects merch, you can go to megamerch.co, and pick yourself up like this. This has absolutely nothing to do with today's video. It's the Russian Concorde, the TUPOLEV, T something, I've forgotten it, but it's available at megamerch.co along with a bunch of other stuff. Also, check out Side Projects if you haven't already. That's a new channel where we do stuff that isn't mega enough for this channel. Also got a link to that below, and let's get into it. Amid the chaos that is Mexico City lies a monument of breathtaking proportions. Oh, I've seen this. I had no idea what it's called. I've actually been there. Standing at 67 meters in height, it is the tallest triumphal arch anywhere in the world, beating the much more well-known Arc de Triomphe in Paris by some 17 meters. Today, it is known as a monument to the lives lost during the Mexican Revolution, which began in 1910, but the story of the Monumento, Revolucion is much more complex than meets the eye, and I also need to apologize for my Spanish pronunciation. It's much more complex than I'm capable of. I don't speak Spanish, it is what it is. This is a building that has come to symbolize both the revolution and in many ways Mexico itself. Its Art Deco designs draw thousands of visitors every year who throng to the Plaza de la República in which it sits. But this is also a structure that is almost unrecognizable from what was originally planned, with a period of construction that spans nearly 40 years and straddled one of the most turbulent and violent periods in Mexican history. This is a building that not only stands as a monument to the revolution, but one that has Mexico's story woven intricately through it. What we see today in Plaza de la República is nothing like what was first planned. The grand structure that was finally completed in 1938 is a triumphal arch, the likes of which can be found across the globe. From ancient Rome to the modern Porta Macedonia in Skopje, which opened in 2012, humans have long built these arch structures to show off their might or to remember their dead. But as the 19th century drew to a close, the site was chosen by the Mexican government for a very different type of building intended to showcase the glory of Mexico. The Palacio Legislativo Federal was a vast, lavish design modeled roughly on the German Reichstag building and would house the congressional chambers of the nation's deputies and senators. Now, before we get into this first building, we should probably set the scene a little, because as I said, it was a tumultuous period in Mexican history that had everything from quasi-dictators, revolution, and the subsequent civil war. President Porfirio Diaz came to power in 1876 and didn't fully relinquish control until he was ousted in 1911. There was a 4-year period when he wasn't president, but power was conveniently transferred to one of his closest allies before moving back to Diaz. His power over Mexico during this time was so all-consuming, the period is known as the Porfiriato. But that's not to say that he was a fully fledged tyrant. Many positive social and economic changes were enacted during the early decades of Diaz's rule, but he certainly outstayed his welcome, and the fraudulent election of 1910 is seen as his tipping point. Amid his pomp and glory, President Diaz ordered the construction of the Palacio Legislativo Federal in the Plaza de la República, and an international competition was held in 1897 to design this sprawling legislative palace. Though a winner was chosen, the Mexican government quickly decided that actually they didn't like what they saw and instead hired architect Emil Bernard to completely redesign the building. The design was a rough square shape fronted with a dramatic colonnade, a series of columns which gave the design a somewhat ancient Rome feel to it. At the center of the palace would be a large gilded dome over a rotunda which would stand imposingly above the rest of the building. Atop the dome was to be a human figure that would represent the Patria, the Mexican fatherland. It was an extravagant yet beautiful design. Construction finally began in 1902, but as the skeletal frame of the rotunda crept skyward, trouble was brewing. From 1905 onwards, a steady resistance against the Diaz regime had been growing. The Mexican Liberal Party was formed in 1905 and began printing a series of anti-Diaz publications. In 1906, labor strikes centered around Mexico's important mining industry, much of which was owned by American businessmen, began, but most were ruthlessly put down by the owners of the mines, often with the full support of the Mexican government. At this point, Diaz was pushing 80 and had been making noises about stepping down for some time, but like many who sink their teeth into power, he changed his mind on numerous occasions. In the 1910 election, he was challenged by Francisco Madero, who hailed from a wealthy landowning family and could hardly be considered a true opposite of Diaz. Now, the president won the election in an absolute landslide, but almost immediately it became clear that, well, the election had been pretty fixed, and an armed revolt broke out in the state of Chihuahua. Madero, the pretender to the Mexican throne, was hardly a Che Guevara figure, and he went as far as hiring the American lawyer and lobbyist Sherburne Hopkins to begin a campaign of discrediting the Diaz regime, particularly in the United States, something that was done, well, remarkably well. A full-scale rebellion soon broke out, and it quickly became clear that support for Diaz was crumbling. In May 1911, a treaty was signed, with Diaz fleeing into exile, apparently with the famous words, "Madero has unleashed a tiger. Let us see if he can control it." Madero was elected president in a new election held in October, but almost immediately things began to go wrong. Diaz's tiger prophecy was about to come true, with some cataclysmic results. Now, you're probably wondering what happened to the Palacio Legislative Federal while all of this was going on. Despite the upheavals around the country, work had continued on the palace, with President Madero even giving his blessing that the building be finished. By 1912, the vast foundations and the metal structure that would form the skeleton of the rotunda had been completed. The vast metal frame had been partially constructed in New York City and then shipped to Mexico over 3 separate journeys, and it now stood expectantly as a new hope for this new Mexico. But alas, things are about to grind to a halt. It was probably no great surprise when the ragtag coalition, which had formed to oust President Diaz, began to implode. While it would be a stretch to say Madero was simply a continuation of Diaz, many of the left-leaning revolutionary groups that had sprung up and who had done much of the dirty work in defeating Diaz now felt betrayed by the new president. Madero had been in place less than a year when a new revolt began, which quickly led to more. The country was spiraling once again into conflict, and work on the palace came to an abrupt stop sometime in late 1912. And would not recommence for nearly 20 years. In February 1913, fighting came to Mexico City, a dark period that has become known as the 10 Tragic Days. The coup began on February the 9th. By the 19th, President Madero had resigned. 3 days later, while on his way to prison, the car carrying the former president pulled into a discreet area away from prying eyes. Whether the order came from the very top or a group acting alone, we'll probably never know. But Madero, along with his vice president, Jose Maria Pino Suarez, were assassinated by the side of the road. A barely plausible story about gunmen trying to rescue the duo was spun, but few in Mexico were under any illusions of what had really happened. Now, unfortunately, we don't have time to delve into the darkest recesses of the Mexican Civil War that followed, but needless to say, from 1913 to 1920, it was absolute chaos across the country. No sooner had President Huerta, the man who replaced Madero, taken power than he too was hounded out of office, which in turn led to the splintering of the opposition against him, who then began fighting each other. Confused? I don't blame you. I am confused as well. This was a tumultuous time in Mexico, with alliances coming and going at breakneck speed, apparently. By 1920, things were beginning to calm down, though. It's good for us following the narrative, although the 1920s and 1930s still had their fair share of violence and political assassinations. But one thing that certainly didn't change during this time was the Palacio Legislative Federal, or should I say the shell of it. What had been designed as a glorious symbol of Mexican power and prestige nearly 40 years before had become a rusting hulk on show for all to see. There was a brief idea to destroy it and build a hotel instead, but nothing ever came of it. Instead, it stood decaying, a blunt reminder of the helter-skelter journey the nation had experienced in the preceding decades. But finally, during the presidency of Lázaro Cárdenas, who came to power in 1934, the structure would be finished, although in a really different form. It was in 1932 that Mexican architect Carlos Obregón Santacía proposed turning the skeleton of the Palacio Legislativo Federal into a monument to the Revolution. The country had been tilting towards socialism for several years, and it's therefore not exactly surprising that what enveloped the steel structure of the palace's rotunda used a style known as Mexican socialist realism, a form of art that Frida Kahlo is also frequently associated with. The plan was to have the monument paid for through national subscription. In 1933, letters had been sent out to governors across the country requesting a small donation towards a monument that was meant to symbolize a strong and united Mexico. Donations even came from the army and certain unions, while individual workers and businesses also contributed. However, these donations only covered a fraction of the eventual cost, thought to be about 10%. The federal government, well, they stumped up the rest. Using Recinto stone, a solidified lava known for its rustic appearance and one that was commonly used for pestle and mortars at the time, the structure of the monument began to rise around the steel rotunda. The arch was covered with a copper-plated dome, below which an observation deck would eventually be constructed. At each corner of the monument are a series of statues created by the sculptor Liviero Martinez, a sculptor who had gained fame through his statue of the revolutionary hero Emiliano Zapata. The human figures are not intended to have a personal likeness, and instead are said to represent national independence, reform, the redemption of the peasant, and the redemption of the worker. And at this point, if you still weren't sure about the socialist slant of the building, well, then look no further. The monument was finally completed on the 20th of November 1938, Revolution Day in Mexico, although strangely there was next to no official ceremony to mark the event. It had been 41 years since the design for the original palace emerged, and though it was a shadow of what had been planned, a completed structure finally stood in the Plaza de la República. Nothing says glory to socialism like a good old-fashioned mausoleum, and over time the remains of 4 revolutionary heroes were transferred to the crypt below the monument, which came to be known as the Pantheon of Outstanding Men of the Revolution. These included Venustiano Carranza in 1942, Francisco Madero in 1960, Plutarco Elias Calles in 1969, Lázaro Cárdenas in 1970, and lastly, Francisco Pancho Villa in 1976. There have long been calls for the remains of the revolutionary General Zapata to also be interred at the monument, but his family have consistently declined to move his body, and it remains in the small city of Cuautla. The Monument à la Révolution is now one of the most popular attractions in the city, but by the 1990s and 2000s, it was beginning to cut a forlorn figure. Extensive renovations were carried out in 2010 to both the monument and the Plaza de la República to celebrate the Revolution centenary. Inside the monument, a glass elevator was added that whisks customers up to the viewing platform, bypassing all of those tedious stairs. Below ground also saw plenty of change, with an exhibition space, art gallery, and National Museum of the Revolution all opening. In front of the monument, a large-scale fountain system was added, which shoots up 100 separate streams of water, again with the 100 years since the beginning of the revolution in mind. The Monumento a la Revolución certainly experienced a dramatic evolution, and it was one that very much mirrored events in Mexico during the first 40 years of the 20th century. From the almost bourgeoisie flamboyance that was the plans for the Palacio Legislativo Federal to the Mexican socialist superstructure that we see today with its severe form and statues of loyal workers, things couldn't really have been any different. It was a building that lulled patiently during the darkest days of the Civil War, only to spring up in radically different form. The imposing arch stands as a monument to the revolution, but with its original steel frame in place underneath, its links go even further back. This is a building that tells of the chaotic, bloody, and ever-changing story of Mexico. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, smash that like button below. Don't forget to subscribe. Don't forget to check out Side Projects, the new channel that covers stuff that's not quite mega. Also, megamerch.co if you'd like to buy a t-shirt. Why not? Thanks for watching.